Okay, I'm going to jump in and get us started here.
Yeah.
Just want to introduce myself. My name's Paige Roncke. I'm the general manager here at Centerbase. I'm very excited to be joined today by Debbie Foster, who, you know, knows more about this topic than she would probably care to admit. Eats, breathes, and sleeps profitability for law firms on a daily basis. She has been doing this for many, many years. I'm sure she won't admit how many, but she is the CEO and founder of Affinity Consulting. And Centerbase is very excited to partner with Affinity Consulting. We obviously care very deeply about software needs for law firms. We are a platform provider of practice management, case management, automatic time capture for attorneys. We want to make sure a law firm runs efficiently and smoothly so that you can maximize profits. And then Debbie, of course, with Affinity Consulting, works with law firms in very similar ways. And I'll let her go ahead and introduce herself and Affinity Consulting.
Thank you, Paige. I do love talking about profitability. I love just talking generally about the business of a law firm. It's one of my favorite topics, and it's an area that we focus on at Affinity. We spend all of our time helping law firms transform from where they are to where they want to be. And that could be related to technology or business strategy or profitability or strategic and succession planning. That's really what we're all about, is how do we help you really assess your current state, what is happening right now, what is working and what's not working, and then how do we think about helping you get to where you want to go. And profitability is always part of that conversation. So when Paige asked me to do this webinar with her, because Paige knows a lot about this topic as well, I was like, yes, let's do it. Let's share what we know.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so excited about this. I am a former practicing attorney turned kind of entrepreneur and business leader. And as Debbie just mentioned, oftentimes as we're thinking about succession planning and growing your law firm for the future, it's very easy to get caught in the cyclical thinking of we bill more time, therefore we make more money and we'll be successful and we'll be able to grow into the future. But there's so many more facets to that. And really, as I kind of grew in my own business and professional career outside of practicing law, I learned a lot more about how a law firm should be run. And Debbie and I, in prepping for this, could talk for hours about this topic because we're so passionate about it. And I firmly believe that as technology starts to influence the decisions within a law firm and influence the infrastructure of a law firm into the future, it will change the competitive landscape for how a law firm has to operate, and therefore profitability becomes extremely important. And that's why we're here today. So I didn't bury the lead. That's what we're going to talk about for most of the hour here. But just to get us started, Debbie, I'll ask you at the top, what does profitability mean to you very generally? What does it mean to the listeners on this call in the context of law firm?
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start and a great place to kind of level set and start from the same definition. Generally speaking, profitability, first of all, it's one of the most important measures of success in your firm. But even taking it a step further, profitability, if we're talking about the definition, it's how do you quickly turn your revenue into profit, right? So revenue minus expenses is profit. That's your profitability. There's a bunch of other things that go into it, but for the purpose of today, we're going to talk about it in very simple terms. And then we're going to dig in from there, because while a lot of law firms operate with the strategy of having as much money as possible left at the end of the day, week, month, year in their bank account, we're going to dig a little bit further into profitability, because while the simple math is absolutely true, what we often don't ask ourselves about profitability is what could the number be, right? So
Mhm.
we all figure out what the number is because the math is the math. But true profitability analysis is really all about what could the number be. And whether that is looking at profitability for your law firm, whether looking at it for a practice area, looking at it for a client, looking at it for a lawyer, we're going to dig into all those different pieces and parts. But essentially, what I think a focus of our law firm should be is how do we maximize profitability? How do we maximize what is left at the end?
Yeah, I think you said something really interesting there, Debbie, that it's not just about what we have left in our bank account at the end of the week, the month, the quarter, the year. It's more than just that bottom line. It's really about digging into the different measurements of profitability. And I love that we're kind of starting with the baseline. It's revenue minus expenses equals your profit. But as we do dig deeper, how would you measure the different revenue streams and expense streams that would target your true profitability?
So I like to give the lawyer answer on that, which is it depends, right? Because it really does depend on a lot of factors. And many firms that we work with are struggling with identifying what is important from a profitability perspective beyond just revenue minus expenses. And so for me, it's about understanding how a law firm, like what do we want the end result to be? How do we want to think about focusing on practice areas, thinking about doing profitable work? If we're going to talk about profitability, what the math equation comes out to, what makes that math equation turn out in our favor is making sure that we are doing profitable work that we're going to get paid for. And then we start to think about how do we slice it and dice it? And maybe most importantly, how do we have a piece of technology that helps us track it, right? If you're trying to track profitability in a spreadsheet, which I spoke to a law firm this morning who's doing some basic profitability calculations in a spreadsheet, and I was like, we could probably think about doing that differently, right? You want to know what the big picture number is for sure. But the big picture number is comprised of lots of smaller numbers. And again, it could be practice area profitability. It could be lawyer profitability. It could be client profitability. It could be matter profitability. There's lots of different ways to look at it, and understanding which one of those options or which combination of those makes sense for your firm. That's where you have to really double down and dig in, is figuring out what makes sense for my firm and how do I start to track it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So basically, you're saying there's a lot of different ways you can slice and dice the inputs. So you can look at profitability in terms of what each practice area grouping might have in terms of profit, which is again just revenue minus expenses for that practice area. But you can also look at it by client or by managing partner group, I'm assuming. Let's take one of those and kind of dig into it as an
Yeah.
example. So let's look at
Yeah.
practice areas as an example. How would you look at that if you were just looking at profitability across practice areas?
So if you don't mind, I'm going to back up for just a second and
Sure.
talk about a different strategy first, and then we'll
Right.
dig into practice area profitability. So I was working with a firm a couple of weeks ago, and profitability was their number one thing they wanted to tackle. And we started doing some really basic math. This is a great place for you to start. If you've never really dug into it, this is a great place to start. So we started doing some really basic math and understanding, like when you look at expenses in a law firm, if you want to reduce your expenses, there are two primary things you can do. Number one, you can deal with the people side of it, right? Because law firms have two, maybe we'll call it three for the purpose of this conversation. Three big expense categories. Number one, people. Number two, space. Number three, technology, right? Those are your three biggest expense items. Technology should be a revenue multiplier. It just
Mm.
should be. Now, you could argue that your people should be a revenue multiplier too. Your space is likely never going to be a revenue multiplier. But if you think about people in space, that's what you have to have technology. By the way, I do tell law firms all the time, you are a legal service provider and you are a data company and you are a technology company. We don't have a choice anymore. It is 2024. We manage a lot of data. We have to run our businesses with technology and we provide legal services. So we're spending money on technology no matter what. You can't just say like, I'm not going to have technology.
Mhm.
So we think about the basics of profitability. I worked with this firm to say, all right, let's split out our expenses and let's say this is our people costs, this is our overhead expenses, everything else that isn't our people costs. We did some very basic math to take those overhead expenses and divide it by their 10 lawyers. And then we looked, this was an insurance defense firm, so this was a big challenge, right? Then we looked at their people costs. And we said, okay, this lawyer, I'm going to use really easy math because then my brain can make the math work really in a really, really easy way. Let's say we have a lawyer that makes $120,000 a year. That means you pay him $10,000 a month. Let's say that they bill 100 hours a month, right? Because that just makes the math easy. It's $100 an hour. That's how much it costs you for that lawyer, $100 an hour. If you're paying the lawyer $100 an hour, then you got to factor in benefits to that, right? So let's say it's $130,000 an hour, $130 an hour before it's all said and done. And then you factor overhead, which whatever that number is, but it's not uncommon for overhead to add $50 or $75 an hour onto every lawyer's cost rate. Mm-hmm. Well, now you're at $200 an hour. That lawyer cannot be doing work for $185 an hour. If you're an insurance defense firm, that's a real story, right? That is a real thing that could be true. And so that's a really, I want to just start with that because that's a really basic way to start to think about. You could come up with a cost rate for your lawyers. Now, how do law firms figure out what their billable rate is? Some firms, that is governed by their clients. They don't get to decide what it is. The client says, this is what we're going to charge. You do some negotiation. Maybe hopefully you get a little bit more than what they said you were going to get. But that's where you are in some clients. But other firms, their hourly rates are based on 3% of what it was last year, which is based on 3% of what it was the year before, which is based on 3% or more, right? Like we never actually did the math to figure out if you were in the widget business, you would know how much it cost you to build a widget.
Yes.
If you were in the wine business, you would know how much it cost you to sell a bottle of wine, right?
Yeah.
Like you would know that. And then you would decide what your price of the wine or the widget was based on how much it costs you. And then you look at the challenge of, I have associates who make $80,000 and associates who make $130,000 an hour. Mm-hmm. Well, we should be really thinking about who we leverage to do what work. This concept of highest and best use is something that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about profitability. So step number one, like, can you come up with a basic cost rate for every lawyer? Now, you might have a lawyer in your firm that makes $1 million a year. Right? Founder of the firm, they make $1 million a year. If you divide that by the however many hours they bill, you're going to come up with a cost rate that is impossible to base an hourly rate on. You have to really think about market rate for the lawyer who's providing the services. So just keep that in mind. If you're an owner of a firm and you're calculating your cost rate, it isn't based on how much money you make because you're a lawyer and you run a profitable law firm. It's really based on the market rate for the legal services. And that's something that we have to really think about here. Now, let's expand that out to a practice area. You can think about your practice area in a couple of different ways. Let's say you have 5 lawyers in your practice area. Okay. Maybe you start with the cost rate. Okay, let's first look at it from a cost rate perspective. What is our range of rates? Who's providing those services? Do we have a gut check on whether that makes sense or not? And then when we look at it from a practice area perspective, we can look at that and say, but two of our lawyers in that practice group are partners and their rate is much higher. We need those associates to do that work. So even though their profit margin isn't as high because their billable rate is lower, it makes sense for us to have them do that work so we can do the higher level strategic work. And we really get focused on which person makes the most sense to do this work? Because we're thinking about it from how much do things cost? Now, if you are lucky enough that you don't bill by the hour anymore, and you figured out a way to bill outside of hours times rate equals amount, it doesn't mean that you can't come up with a cost rate still. It doesn't mean that you can't understand what a full plate of work for an associate lawyer looks like. So if you're expecting them to bill 1,400 hours a year, 1,800 hours a year, and you know what their cost rate is, and you factored in overhead into that cost rate, you can come up with what your revenue target is based on what profit margin you want for your practice area, right? So we can look at it from the top going down, we can look at it from the bottom going up. But if you really want to dig into profitability, whether it's by person or by practice area, you have to understand how much it costs you to deliver the services that you're providing. And sometimes that feels like really hard, but there are some easy ways to do it that some might say that's not actually exact enough. And I say it's more exact than not measuring it at all, right? Like it's a great
I think that's
starting point.
important right there. This may seem kind of mind expanding, right? It's like, whoa, you're throwing a lot at me. I have to understand all of these attorneys' effective rates. I have to understand how I have a blend of different effective rates within a practice area. But at a very basic level, understanding what the cost is per hour for an attorney that's within a practice area. If you can distill it down to that, and even if it's what I think you're getting at is even if it's a swag, even if it's
Right.
not exactly perfect, like, I didn't count the tiles in their ceilings in their
Uh-huh.
office, exactly how big that attorney's office space is compared to everyone else, even if it's just office space divided by 10 or however many attorneys you
Yeah.
have, you're still able to get a more direct, effective rate
Mhm.
or cost rate for each attorney. And at a very basic level, what I'm hearing from you is start there. So you can
Start
understand what
exactly.
they should be billing.
Exactly. And I think it without like jumping, I know we have a bunch of other topics, but one other thing, the bigger your firm, the harder it is to define what is fair from an overhead perspective,
Mhm.
right? So we work with a lot of, like most firms have 3 generations of people working in it. Some have 4, some have 5 now. That means that in some firms, you have older lawyers who have a dedicated legal assistant or legal secretary, where
Right.
younger lawyers there might share one. And so we're kind of thinking about this from what does it look like from this 10,000 foot view? Maybe not 30,000 foot, because I feel like 30,000 is all the money in, all the money out. That's what the bottom line is. So if we go
Sure.
to the 10,000 foot view, and we start to think about, there are some discrepancies in how we might apply overhead. Not
Mm.
every practice group is the same. Not every lawyer is the same when it comes to what kind of services do they need from our accounting department, right? So if you have if you have a personal injury practice group, they might not need as much from your billing team as your family law group, right? It's not,
There.
but it doesn't mean like you could really say, okay, what percentage of the billing team is used? And sometimes people get so caught up in the details of counting the ceiling tiles or trying to figure out, like, how many calls did we get last month? How many of them were for the family law department? We're going to allocate the reception at, that gets you spun around an axle. And then people start debating whether you calculated that right. If you stick with that, if you've never focused on profitability before, the first place to go is something a little bit higher level where it's not going to be exact. But like you said, the sway is not going to make a big, giant difference, because remember, at the end of the day, the in minus the out equals what's left, right? So you're just trying to figure out where that comes from.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially if you're starting out from square one and you're trying to understand the basics of profitability. You're going from 30,000 feet to 10,000 feet,
Mm-hmm.
is having a basic understanding of that cost structure, because what that can do for you, from what I'm hearing is you're able to have a general sense of, am I billing the right rate for each attorney working within a practice group? And am I level loading the work appropriately? So do I have attorneys with a lower cost rate doing more of the work versus an attorney who has a higher cost rate doing less? So I can start to balance out the mix of how I level load hours within a practice area group, which starts to help you adjust your profitability for that practice area group. But you can also do that by client. You can look at different clients and understand, is this client profitable for my firm? if I compare them against other clients within my firm, which allows you to start to understand if you should be adjusting their billable rate.
Yeah. It's and in mid-sized firms and larger, you hear a lot of talk about leverage and how do large law firms make money? They have associates who are billing 1,900 or 2,000 hours a year, and they're getting paid, not certainly not what the partners are getting paid, nor do I think they should be, but they are profit centers. If you can train them the right way, get them to bill, not write off all of their time, right? Because there's lots of levers when it comes to profitability too. One other thing that I think is an important point as we're talking about like practice groups and cost rates and things like that. Oftentimes, when you start to dig to your practice groups, what you find is you have profitable practice groups, very profitable practice groups, and practice groups that are not profitable at all. And when we start to talk about relationships within the firm,
Mhm.
most people know, like I often joke and say, no one has to hire a weatherman to tell them it's raining outside. You just look out the window and you're like, yep, it's raining out there. A lot of times firms actually know which ones are the practice groups that are not profitable. But what we don't follow all the way through, and this leads to a lot of resentment and it leads to departures from firms, is when you have an unprofitable practice group, the people in your profitable practice group, especially your partners who are seeing what's going on, are like,
Mhm.
so we're making up for that, right? So maybe the 30,000 foot view looks not so bad, right? In, out equals this. But when you figure out that what that actually means is a plus 100, a plus 100, and a minus 50, the plus 100 and the plus 100 are the practice groups that suffer because
Yep.
you have, right? So it's really looking at it in the aggregate is important, but it's also really important to dig into the details.
Yeah, it makes a difference. I mean, as you mentioned, it can get very political within law firms.
Mhm.
And it can be emotional work at times, depending on the political infrastructure and the dialogue within your firms and how you are set up amongst managing partners or partner groups. But what can really help you is leveraging data, is what I'm
Yeah.
hearing. Because it takes the air out of the balloon, so to speak. It's instead of creating dialogue from should we be at 30,000 foot level and you're looking at, well, the firm is profitable. Why are we having these discussions? The 10,000 foot level, when you can put data behind those figures and you can understand objectively where profit and cost lies within the firm, you can have a more objective conversation about what changes need to be made. And there is a thread of fairness that can help the conversation, which, attorneys can argue both sides of every single story. That's what they're trained in. But at the core of that sentiment is a fair outcome. And I think it's really important that data can help push those conversations along. But if you haven't done this before, if you haven't done this calculation, and if you're looking to create some infrastructure in your firm to make data-driven decisions, where do you start to build an infrastructure to do that?
I mean, for me, it always starts with the technology and data and how we track data, right? Like, if you're a family law firm, I don't want you to have a single practice area called family law. I want you to have
Hmm.
prenups and post-judgment issues and dissolution. Maybe you have a dissolution and a dissolution with children, so you understand the difference between them, right? It starts with what do we actually want to track? And what kind of information is the data going to give us to help us make smart business decisions? Now, you might be in a situation where you're like, that's awesome, but I can't change software programs. I don't think the one that I have can do it. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. And if you have to start this on a spreadsheet, you can certainly do it. But back of the napkin math, the number of times I have thrown up one of those white pieces of paper on a wall and said, okay, y'all are worried about this particular practice area. Let's just throw some numbers out. Let's throw some numbers out here, and I can, with a marker and a white piece of paper, come up with a sway. It's not always exactly right, but okay, you have 4 attorneys in that group. This is the average. This is what they bill. Like, it's really, really easy math. So I think the starting point is, what software program are you using? And
Mm.
how have you set it up for success to help you keep track of the categories, the kinds of work that you're doing? And then how are you allocating expenses? So for me, when I talk to a firm about profitability, there's always some reports that I want to see, because profitability is, as we defined it in the beginning, it is in fact about money in minus money out equals what's left.
Right.
But let's talk about what impacts money in, right? So where do we start? Y'all can just write these few things down, and maybe someone will take some notes. Oh, we have it recording. We'll grab the notes from the recording. So what impacts money in the door? Attorneys capturing all of their time. For the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to assume we bill hourly for our time, or at least we're tracking our time, right?
Let's start there.
Okay, so do attorneys capture all of their time? The answer is no, by the way. That's number one. So sometimes my description of a law firm is it's a bucket that has lots of holes in it. So how do we start to plug up the holes? The first hole is, do we capture the time for all the work that we're doing? The second hole after that is,
Mm.
and maybe this is even like above that, the hole of, do we capture all of our time? Do we call our leads back? When someone reaches out to us, do we respond back to them within the same business day and talk to them? Do we make it easy for them to do business with us? Do we have an automated way to generate a retainer letter? Do we collect a retainer in advance so we know that we're going to get paid for the work that we're doing, right? Like, there's some business development things that absolutely impact the revenue in. So we've got time capture.
Mm-hmm.
If you follow that through, the next thing that happens is pre-bill review. How much time gets written off at the pre-bill stage because of our perception of the client's willingness to pay, or because of our perception of how long something took? I could get on a whole soapbox about this, Paige, but
Absolutely. And a lot, sister. I mean, just thinking about write-offs alone, if you could look
yes,
at data in
right,
certain firms,
right,
and some of it is of fear-based write-offs. It's not necessarily
yes,
data-driven, not even client-driven. Sometimes it's
right.
just a biased perception by the managing partners or by the attorney themselves who's doing the work. And there's a lot there that we could dig into. You're right. It could be like a whole another hour, right?
I could go, but I will say this one thing to consider. And I hear this all the time. Well, sometimes I have to write off their time because they took 2 hours to do it and it would have only taken me one. I'm like, okay, but you bill $800 an hour and they bill $350 an hour. So if it would have taken you one, you would have charged them 800. It took them two and they're going to get charged 700. It's a deal. It's not about how much time would it have taken you. Of course, I expect that it would have taken you less time. That's why your rate is higher, right? We
Right.
should really be, because write-off happens, as you know, in two places. It happens before the client even gets the bill, and then it
Yes.
happens after the client gets the
Of
bill,
course.
right?
There's always a negotiation. Yes.
Right. So those are the things that are in, and then collections. If you, when I look at a firm's AR report,
Mhm.
I typically will run it and I will joke and say, so why don't we just write this $2 million off that's over 90 days? And they're like, oh, no, we wouldn't want to write it off. We might collect it. I'm like, likely not. 90 days? Unless you have some special circumstances, like they owe you a lot of money and someone's selling a house and you're going to get paid when the house sells.
Right.
We're carrying all this accounts receivable. So what is our AR policy? Is it our bill is due within 15 days? Do we have an evergreen retainer policy that we're not enforcing, right? This is all, how do we impact the top?
Yep.
But
And these
guess
are
what?
really great. These are great points. I'm just going to recap them because you had four
Yeah,
really
sure.
great points that you just
Okay.
talked through. First one being when a lead comes in the door, Are we following up on that lead appropriately in a timely manner with the right resources to convert that lead into a client? Number one, that's your first chance to generate revenue for the firm.
Mhm.
And secondly, as you are working with that client, are you capturing all of the time that you're working with that client? Whether it's an associate attorney, a managing partner, or anyone else within the firm, quite frankly, who is working on that client file, texts, phone calls, emails, um, printing copies, whatever it may be. You want to capture every moment of that time that is clear revenue. Number three, as you are creating that bill, are we writing down hours that we shouldn't be? Do we have a clear understanding of why a certain person billed that time to that client and the value of that time in billing, both to the firm and to the client, and how you have policies around write-offs? And then the fourth is, how do you collect? Once you have billed that client, what is your policy around AR? What is your collection cadence and process? Meaning, we send an invoice out, that's not where it stops. There's follow-up, there's negotiation that happens, and you also can understand this by client because it does change by client. Let's not be naive to that fact. But having a policy there so that you don't get stuck in the 90-day mark writing off a bunch of outstanding bills.
Yeah. No, that great recap. That was awesome. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times when I'm talking to a client about profitability,
Mm.
they don't always say I have a profitability problem, but they often say our expenses are too high.
Okay,
And I regularly come back with, what if
sure.
your revenue is too low?
I
Right?
love the
Because
challenging question. Yes. Have you considered those four areas?
have you considered? And so, listen, everybody wastes money. We all know everybody wastes money. But at the end of the day, unless you're going to deal with people, space, or get rid of some of your technology, you're not going to make anywhere near the impact by cutting expenses than you will make by focusing on increasing revenue. And that is not to say that you should not pay attention to your expenses. You absolutely should. But the reality is, if we really want to impact our bottom line, our chances of success at doing that without collateral damage, like we're going to cut a person, and now everybody has to they feel like they have to do more. Whether they have to do more or not, they feel like they have to do more.
Right.
It's just easier to make that up on the top line and start thinking about those four things that Paige recapped. So again, I'm not opposed to the expense cutting, but I also think that, when you're thinking about the money that you spend, having an understanding of how people spend their day. And most of you have that for your lawyers, but you don't
Mhm.
always have that for the rest of your team. And I'm not suggesting that everybody enters their time, but I am suggesting that oftentimes 4 hours of work expands to 8.
Mhm.
And we need to be thinking about that. I just recently worked with a firm that had 15 lawyers and they had 3 full-time billing people. 15 lawyers, 3 full-time billing people. I was like, no,
Why?
that's they've always had 3 full-time billing people. And they used to have 30 lawyers, but they just always they kept the 3 full-time billing people. We do need to be cautious and careful. And it's like if we're worrying about this when we're worrying about profitability, it's too late, right?
Hmm.
General business principles about making sure that you understand what it costs you to deliver the services that you're providing includes making sure that you are properly staffed. And properly staffed does not define, do we have enough people? It's also, do we have too many people? And what are people doing? And how do we think about like the
You have
most
the right
logical way?
people.
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
so it's something, it's something that everyone should consider and you should be thinking about, when you look at the work that is assigned to the people on your team, that whether they're providing legal services work or whether their clients are the lawyers in the law firm and the paralegals and the billing people in the law firm. You should really be looking at what it takes to get that job done and understanding how people are spending their days and making sure that we are working as efficiently as we can possibly work.
I think that's where it's an interesting intersection between the cost centers and the revenue centers. So if you're looking at your cost centers, people, space, and technology, and you start with the kind of red herring of I'm going to look at my expenses to increase my profitability instead of looking at revenue. You're going to say I need to cut back on technology or I need to change people, but you're not sure even where to do that because
Yeah.
you aren't looking at where your profit is sitting. So I see this a lot in technology. Obviously, I live my life in legal technology, as do you, to a large extent. But I see this common pitfall in firms where they look at their technology costs and say, well, we have to cut our technology costs because it's a really easy bucket to get their arms around. It's less political. There aren't people involved. It's very easy to add up all of your vendor invoices and say this cost is too high. But if you look at the profit side of your business and you look at lead generation and you look at capturing more time and you look at understanding where you write off bills and you look at your AR policies, all four of those can be affected by the right technology. You can find efficiencies in all four of those by having the right technology and, quite frankly, the right people who know how to use that technology. That's where you start maximizing your profit. And I'd love for you to have more commentary on common pitfalls of,
Yeah.
where kind of go awry, because that's an obvious one to me where when you look at expenses first, as you mentioned, maybe not where you want to focus first. You start looking at that technology bucket and you cut it instead of maximizing technology to focus on your profit centers or your revenue centers. And that's where you can pick up those point ones and point twos if you have automatic time capture. I mean, obviously, Centerbase offers that, so I'm biased, but there's other pieces of technology out there that can help you um, give yourself a lift in revenue centers. So,
Yeah.
more commentary on pitfalls or any commentary on how technology can help you advance your revenue streams.
I think the technology one is a really interesting pitfall, and it's something that every firm struggles with figuring out how to effectively use the technology they've invested in. And some firms go to the extent of saying, we bought this, we're not using it, we're going to stop paying for it. Most firms continue to pay for it because they've gotten some traction, but not enough traction.
Mhm.
And sometimes we even use really simple examples, like let's just take Microsoft Word as an example. It has 100 features. Every legal professional uses somewhere between 7 and 10 of those 100 features. Now,
Guilty.
50 of them you don't need. But 50 of them are like insert clip art here. You do not need clip art. Like that's not going to change your life, right? But arm wrestling with complex paragraph numbering, trying to figure out how to get your first page number to go away and, have the second
Yeah.
one go away instead of the first
Yeah.
one. Like really learning how to use styles, really leveraging a tool that is so incredibly powerful. Like Microsoft Word can be a multiplier. Not to mention the fact that it can reduce your stress at work. And I got like the amount of stress that lawyers are under at work, it's bananas, right? Like there's a lot of stress in the legal profession. There's study after study after study, data after data after data that proves that is true. And whether it is something as simple as Microsoft Word or using Centerbase as an example, we're a Centerbase partner, and we talk to our clients all the time, and it doesn't matter. Insert product name here. They call us and they say, we don't like this product. And I'm like, why? And they're like, it can't do this and this and this. And I'm like, yes, it can, right? It happens all the time. And so we've invested in this technology. I think where the mistake is we put a lot of focus and effort on what leads up to rolling out the software and not a lot of focus and effort in what happens in the 6 months after we roll out a new software program, right? Because
Absolutely.
the
Yes.
implementation is done and we've gone live, But, you know, if I taught you a class and I told you 30 things that you could do, you're lucky to remember 4 of them. And only if you use those 4 every day do they become a part of your normal habit. Like, we have got to marry up our technology spend with building a culture of training. And when we
Yes.
build that culture of training, it isn't just that we can work more efficiently, but we have people who are happier at work. They are less frustrated with the tools that they're using. We have less turnover. Like, every one of these things is really connected. So I think inefficient use of technology is absolutely a profitability pitfall. The other thing that I'll say is a profitability pitfall, and you know, what one of the, and I think Paige, you and I talked about this before, but you know, attracting and retaining talent is a really big struggle for firms right now.
Yes. Let's talk about that.
Um, and we hire people, and we're like, "Hi, we're so glad you work here now. Here's about it like an hour of training on what we do here. Oh, and by the way, we don't actually have any standardization. So we have 11 lawyers. You're going to work for these 3. They all do things differently. This one does not use our document management system because she doesn't like it. This one writes down all of their time on a legal pad and you have to type it for them. And this person, the only font this person will allow on any documents that are created is Tahoma, and the rest of our firm hates that font. So you can only use Tahoma when you're working for him. But we're really glad you're here. And if you have any questions, the person sitting next to you, her name is Jane. She'll be happy to answer them for you. And then we're frustrated when people quit. Now, you all might be like, that example is really extreme. Or you
It's
might be like, wait, have you been looking into, like, do you have a camera in my firm? Right? How,
behind me, you're watching me work.
right. It is incredibly inefficient to let the silos be wild, wild west kind of silos. And I'm not talking about everybody has to practice law the same way, but we can certainly agree on a font and we can agree on expectations about how time gets put in. And we
Yes.
can agree that for the greater good of the firm, we invested in a document management system and we're actually going to use it because it's important that all of our data is in one place. That
That
is
requires,
a big
yeah.
hole in the bucket.
It's a huge deal for new associates coming out of law school. And, if you're listening in, you're an attorney, firsthand, you aren't trained on how to practice law in law school. That is the job of your first intern or your summer associate position. And often, you're right, Debbie, you don't get that training. This is the managing partner that you're working under. He may or may not be invested, or she may or may not be invested in training you or showing you the ropes. So you're probably going to get a subpar training experience. And then you're going to cobble together best practices from the folks that you spend time with over the course of that summer and you move forward. But there, there is a big hole in the bucket. That is a big leaky hole. You're putting people and resources into that bucket in terms of investment for future profits. And you're leaking out all this time and expertise because they don't know how to use the technology that you've employed and or they don't know how to keep time effectively. A lot of folks, this is very common, they're trained to, well, if you're out of office and you're in the car, just like keep a note on your cell phone or, keep a running note in your notebook of who you called or who you texted or where you spent time that morning. And it kind of falls apart over time because we're busy and we're mobile. We're in Ubers, we're on flights, we're now working from home or coffee
Mhm.
shops or going to speak to different clients. And it's not, especially in this changing world of law firms may be in the office, but a lot of our clients are not. They're much more
Right.
mobile. They're not more likely to come in for a meeting in person. They probably aren't sitting in an office. It's much more flexible work hours. So it's difficult. You're right. Having those policy decisions and those training resources available at a firm, again, you would think that's a cost that you may instinctively want to cut out of the bottom line of your firm, but instead it maximizes your investment in revenue streams. It maximizes the firm's investment in profitability by investing in its people, by investing in how those people go through the 4 ways that you can create revenue and profit, which is making sure you follow up on leads, you capture time effectively, you're billing your time effectively to the point where you don't feel you need to write off that time because you build it appropriately in accordance with policy, and that you're following up with your clients on AR.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, maybe the fifth one is that you are tuned in to how much money you spend. Like, it shouldn't be the biggest focus unless you just know you're wasting a ton of money, but it's definitely like, let's make sure that the money that we spend, that we're really leveraging what we bought, whether it is our people or whether it is the
Mhm.
technology that we purchase or it's our space. Like, we think about space planning. Let's think about people planning, and let's
Yeah.
think about technology planning. And Paige, I just did a presentation on Monday at a conference in Atlanta, and I said, how many of you have software that's based in the cloud? And almost 100 people in the room, almost everyone raised their hand. And I said, how many of you, when you log into that cloud-based software and you get a pop-up that says, welcome to the latest version of insert product name here, click here to read what's new. How many of you click there to read what's new? And two people raised their hand. I'm
Absolutely
like,
not.
you can't even just, like I said before, the magic of software, a successful software implementation happens in the 6 months following, but it is a continuous improvement cycle.
Mhm.
Software companies, I mean, you run one. Software companies are constantly like, how many new feature requests does Centerbase have right now? 10,000? And you're
Oh
like
my goodness,
rolling them out,
absolutely.
right? Like
Constantly.
all the time. So we can't just pay attention to this one time. This is a continual thing that we should be thinking about. How do we really leverage the money that we're spending on technology?
Absolutely. And you're hitting on a kind of nerve here a little bit, because there is something that ties back to retention, that ties back to increasing profitability, where it's about the culture that you set within your firm around following policies and utilizing technology, even if the technology utilized is Excel or
Yeah,
Microsoft Suite. That is a technology suite that you are paying for.
yeah,
And it kind of comes down to, how do you create, like, if I was to distill, where do you start? We could talk wax poetically about this for hours, about making sure you care about your revenue streams, and
yeah,
maximize your cost centers if you're going to have them. But if I were to start tomorrow within my firm, I'd start with a conversation of, this needs to be important to us. And it has to be important to us because the technology world is changing. It's changing very rapidly. And I'm sure everyone on this call feels that deeply, because we're all inundated with spam emails about the next AI thing. And AI is everywhere in the media and it's all over my inbox. I can't delete emails fast enough. I obviously very deeply think about AI on a daily basis, but let's set that aside for a second as the up and coming new shiny thing that we will all eventually use, and we're using in some ways now already. But before you even get there, you need to deeply contemplate how you use basic technology in your firm, how you think about using technology in your firm, so you're prepared to bring on these bright and shiny new software programs in the future. Today, where I would start is think about how we change our culture around reading the banner that says, here's the new feature for Microsoft Word or for Centerbase or for whatever it is, how you get excited, how you do lunch and learns every Thursday in your, little coffee chat area. And you talk about the new ways or new tips and tricks for how you can do the thing in Word or in Teams or whatever it may be, because it starts to create a culture of, yes, we can and we will improve, get more efficient, we will care. And it will eventually add up to being able to bring on new technology and use it really well. And you will be more competitive in the market in the next 12 to 24 months. Because, no surprise, if you want to create a legacy firm that will be profitable beyond, just these basics, and you can actually dig into how you maximize and start building your profit centers, you have to be able to have culture of utilizing technology and caring about utilizing it consistently.
Yeah,
This
I
being my
agree.
soapbox, but it really makes a difference, and you will not be able to escape it in the next couple of years. It will be the norm.
I agree. And I think like my closing comment would be, if you want to focus on profitability, instead of focusing on numbers, focus on how your work gets done and improving how your work gets done. And
Mm,
that is about process. It's about training people. It's about leveraging technology. It's about all of those things that absolutely plug the holes in the leaky bucket. That's what it is. It's really, we have to think differently about how work gets done and how our businesses are run. Those two things done right will increase profitability. There's no question they will increase profitability.
absolutely. Um, and there's so many different tools and avenues that we can use and dig into deeper. There's a few other topics we wanted to get to today that I don't think we're going to get to. I'm going to tease them a little bit
Yeah.
because we have a second version of this webinar. If you're listening in or you're getting this recording after the fact, we're going to have a second version of this webinar. We're going to dig into a few other topics that we really want to talk about, which is how do you compensate your employees, and how do you think about the complexity or the complexion of your compensation over all of the different roles in your firm, from first year associate to shareholder managing partner. We want to think about shareholder equity and entitlement and what that means in terms of profit sharing, but also in terms of the political landscape that is part of all of the discussions. I mean, it's a very heavy influencer in all the things we've been discussing today. But we also want to talk about benchmarking. So how do you use benchmarking effectively, and what are the common pitfalls of using benchmarking? What does that even mean? How do you understand where and what you should be billing for whom? And it goes to those four profitability areas. And so basically we're diving in a little bit deeper into the cost of people, right? And how you think about the cost of people in terms of compensation and equity. And then two, how you maximize your billing generally by using benchmarking and understanding what your rate should be and to whom. So that's coming up. Also, of course, want to encourage questions. There's one question we have. We might be able to slip it in. I'm going to try to ask you, Debbie, really quickly. I don't know if we're going to be able to get into it very deeply because we have 3 minutes left, but I'm going to ask it anyway, since it's a question we have, and we'll see what we can do. How do you determine a good revenue per employee ratio?
So if you and I were having a conversation, I would say, tell me why you think that's the most important thing to measure. And I'm not saying that it isn't the most important thing to measure, but oftentimes when I get questions that are specific like this, I'm like, there's something behind this. And so sometimes, like, the story behind that might be, at my last firm, we made $1 million per employee. And now we're like, oh my gosh, at his last firm, he made $1 million per employee. How do we do that here? So because I can't get the answer to that question from you, here's what I would say. It is pretty easy for you to project forecast revenue per billable timekeeper, right? If you bill hourly, it's pretty easy to do that. You can say this person, their expectation is that they're going to bill 1,600 hours. This is going to be their average hourly rate. We're going to subtract 10%. If I'm being a smart aleck, I say because we like to give 1 out of every 10 hours we work away for free. Because that really puts it in
Yeah.
context. You're like, no, I actually don't want to do that. Okay, but when we write off 10% of what we do, that's actually what we're doing. So you can pretty easily get to that number, right, for a timekeeper. And then you have to start thinking about how many non-timekeepers do you have? What is your ratio of timekeepers per non-timekeepers? Then you have to, if you can come up with what your ratio is, and that ratio is right, you can get to add up all the revenue, that your maximum revenue that your timekeepers are going to generate, add up how many other people you have on the list, and then add it together, divide it by the number of people. And there's your revenue per employee at the highest level, right? So I think that's one way that you can think about it. But if you have if you want to follow up on that, we would love, like, drop us an email. I don't know, our contact information will be somewhere. Happy to follow up more specifically on that question. But that's what I would say in 2 minutes or less.
I love it, Debbie. Thanks for the quick answer. Just as we wrap up here, thanks for the time. You're going to get an email with a recording and more information about Affinity Consulting and Centerbase. Of course, you can always go to centerbase.com or look up Affinity Consulting. Obviously, Debbie is a wealth of knowledge on this topic. So if you have more questions, please reach out to Debbie directly. You'll have our contact information also in that follow-up email. The next webinar is October 24th, and we'll be digging more into those topics I just teased, like compensation, benchmarking, and shareholder equity. So thank you for the time this morning, this
Absolutely.
afternoon. Thank you, Debbie, and safe travels.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.